Thank you, Brianne. That piece about questions and answers at the end was a reminder to me. Brianne has told me many times that I'm the only person she knows who, in giving a movie review, takes longer to give the review than it takes to watch the movie. So I'm going to be very mindful of that and kind of introduce myself as I go along. Let me start by sharing the PowerPoint slides that I'm going to use for the presentation, and make sure that those are all visible and start the slideshow, and then I'll do the introduction. So there we are. So this presentation is kind of a reprising of a seminar week that I did last summer out at the Cape Cod Institute in Eastham, Massachusetts. And it's about the Cape Cod Institute, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is 41 years old. It's been a place where organization development practitioners have gone and taught and learned from each other over the years. And I was honored to be invited to be one of the OD practitioners last year, and I've been invited back for this summer session. So I'll be teaching there from July 6th through 10th this summer. And the materials I'm going to share with you are kind of a summary of what I tried to cover while I was out there. And in essence, it parallels my development as a leader and an educator. I started my work in the public service. I was working for municipal governments here in Duluth, Minnesota, managing the personnel department, and came up to the College of St. Scholastica back in 1986 to listen to a woman whose name is Jessica Jenner describe a new Master of Arts in Management program that she was offering here. The reason I went to the meeting was to figure out whether I should allow tuition reimbursement for city employees who are going to have an interest in the program. And I was so fascinated by the program she described that I became a student in the program myself. And that is really where I got exposed to the principles of organization development. And that catapulted my working career from being kind of a mid-level manager in city government to eventually becoming the city administrator for the city of Duluth, the top administrative job there. And then after that, in the healthcare field as a member of the senior leadership team at what was then SMDC, now Essentia Health. Much of that movement in my own career parallels the development of organization development, which I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to start by telling you what it is for those of you who are not as familiar with OD as I am. I'm going to talk about its evolution and then try to apply those principles to leadership. A lot of people think that organization development is only for consultants, and there was a time, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, when that seemed to be the case, but it's certainly no longer true. That leaders of all levels in organizations, or people who aspire to leadership, can utilize OD principles and become much more successful in their work. So let me start with the traditional organization development. And if you remember nothing else about this presentation, note that it is organization development, not organizational development. Organization is a noun. Organizational is an adjective. We're talking about developing the entire organizational system. And that's why we call it organization development. Whereas organizational development, I'm not entirely sure what people mean when they use that word or that phrase, but it's some aspect of an organization, I presume. So what is organization development? It's been defined in many ways over the years. It's a planned system-wide approach using behavioral science methods. That was a definition that was actually written many years before the book in which it appeared, but Dick Beckhard was the person who named organization development when he was working in 1959 at General Mills here in Minnesota with Douglas McGregor, who you may know as the Theory X, Theory Y person. Here's another definition. It's a planned process by which an organization uses its resources to bring about controlled change for the purpose of improving its service or product. I like that definition, not only because I wrote it many years ago, but because I've stolen it from many traditional organization development practitioners over the years. And you know what they say about that? If you steal an idea from someone and fail to give credit, that's called plagiarism. But if you steal it from many people, that is called research. So consider my definition, research. And here's a more contemporary approach from one of my friends and colleagues, Jervis Bush, who I'll talk about a little bit later on. OD is about creating great teams and organizations. So that is kind of the definition of OD. Now, with that said, let me say that not all change qualifies as organization development. There are certain characteristics that need to be present before it is truly organization development. It could be something else. It could be change management. It could be certain aspects of human resource management. But to qualify as OD, it needs to respond to both the actual and the perceived need for change on the part of the client group. And I emphasize that piece about perception. It becomes especially important later in this presentation when we're talking about the social construction of reality, kind of a postmodern approach to change. The second element is it needs to involve the client in the planning and the implementation of the change. In other words, it's not something that's enforced from the top of an organization. It is something that involves people throughout the organization from the very moment they start. And ultimately, it leads to a change in both the organization's overall system as well as its culture, especially if those changes are successful. There is a certain amount of confusion with another practice that has emerged over the last 10 years or so called change management, but don't confuse OD with change management. They're not the same thing. The best comparison between organization development and change management that I've seen comes from another friend of mine, Dave Jamieson, who runs the doctoral program in organization development at the University of St. Thomas. OD is a systems-wide approach. It involves people early in the cycle. It focuses on how the overall system functions, and the design interventions are intended to modify higher order issues. Change management is more project-oriented. It kind of deals with individuals who may be resisting change, kind of catalyzing them to bring about change, and it's structured. It usually involves very specific tools that are part of a change management approach. It's not that one is better than the other, it's that organization development works in a whole variety of situations, including very complex organizational challenges, whereas change management is really reserved for fairly simple changes of a technical nature by and large. There are overlaps, both focus on human dynamics. People are critical in both cases, and both can improve organizational effectiveness. There are certain principles or values of organization development that I want to mention briefly, and I'll expand on these a little bit as we go forward. The first is democracy, the involvement of everybody in the organization and active participation. One of the strong influences in the evolution of organization development was Kurt Lewin the correct German pronunciation is Lewin, but after he came to this country, Lewin one day said, "Tell them to refer to me as Lewin because they're confusing my email address or my mail address, and I'm not getting all the letters that I had hoped to receive." So he was the one who actually said, "Call me Lewin." Freedom of choice, freedom of speech is another value that's always been part of OD. The spirit of inquiry, trying to find out, trying to learn, creating helping relationships, basic humanistic values and social justice, and generativity, teaching people to fish versus solving problems for them, giving them the capacity to solve future questions or problems that no one knows of at the time that the OD practitioner or boss using OD practitioner principles knows of. And cooperation, honest, direct communication with no backstabbing. So those are values that are important to the practice of OD. There were important predecessors to organization development. One of them was sensitivity training, or T groups, at the National Training Laboratories out in Bethel, Maine, back in the 40s. Kurt Lewin was a major influence in the evolution of the NTL programs. Unfortunately, he died unexpectedly of a heart attack and never got to experience the National Training Laboratory himself directly, but many of the people who were planning it with him did, including Lippitt and Bradford and Benny and others. So that was an important contributor to the practice of OD. And much of what we know about human behavior in groups was stuff that we really learned out at NTL. The second significant influence is socio-technical systems, in particular, the work that was done at the Tavistock Institute, Eric Trist, Fred Emery, and Rice. What they discovered in studying coal miners was that there was a very interesting technology that went into the work that they were doing, but they also realized that there was a social system that was equally important and in some ways more important than the task base of what the work entailed, that people in that line of work, working far deep underground and in fairly dangerous situations, had to really rely on each other and get to know each other's strengths and weaknesses. So socio-technical systems is a big contributor to organization development. And also the survey research of Rensis Lickert at the University of Michigan. Most of you get in the mail questionnaires that say on a scale of 1 to 10, to what extent do you agree with the following statements? That's a Lickert scale. Both Lewin and Lickert like the idea of using evidence, of using numbers to understand, learn about social interaction. And when Lewin died unexpectedly, his research center for group dynamics, which had been at MIT, was moved to the University of Michigan, where parts of it still reside in the Ross Business School. So those are three significant predecessors of OD. Traditional OD processes, there are a variety of different models, but this is a typical one that kind of represents what all of them cover. There's a scouting component where in those days consultants would try to figure out if they could be helpful to an organization, put themselves in a position to be evaluated by a client group. The entry, which means a couple of things to me. It could mean entering a contract, which is certainly one part of what it means, whether it's a psychological contract or a written contract. But it also means to me, where in the organization do you enter? To be true to OD principles, you really have to develop relationships with everyone in the organization. It's not something that you simply have to have the CEO or president agree needs to occur and then enforce it on others. So even if your initial contact in an organization comes from that level of leadership, once you start working with the actual client group, it's really important to develop a psychological agreement with everybody in the group. From that point, usually there's a collection of data, which could be done in different ways. I prefer to work in groups because typically that's where the issues are in the group themselves. But there are other ways to do it. Survey research is possible, and there are a whole variety of different techniques that can work. The data then gets fed back to the client group. The consultant or the leader that's using those principles helps them diagnose and analyze the data. They develop a plan of action, an implementation plan, and evaluate. So that's the typical model in traditional organization development. And I won't go deeply into this model, but I think it's helpful to realize the impact that this model of Lewin's had on how people view change. His thinking was essentially that before an organization is going to change, first you must help them unfreeze their thinking. If they're happy with the status quo, there's going to be very little motivation to change. So it's important for them to develop a certain healthy anxiety about their current situation. In a for-profit business, that might be if there was increasing competition and they were experiencing declining revenue and weren't certain about their future. To get everybody in the organization realizing that it was important for them to make changes if the organization was going to survive. Ed Schein has referred to that as survival anxiety. I'll introduce Schein in a few minutes. Schein was a major influence in my own practice of OD, and he's somebody I've got to know over the years and have studied with on a number of occasions. The second phase, once people are kind of unsatisfied with the current situation, they have to learn what they can do differently. And that can occur in a whole lot of different ways. Once they have learned a new way of doing things and have moved to that approach, Lewin said it's important to kind of refreeze their thinking, internalize it, because if you don't, there's a likelihood they'll move back to the old method. So there were a variety of steps that were involved in doing that. And I won't spend a lot of time on these, but these will kind of flesh out the idea that I was talking about, the idea of creating a certain healthy survival anxiety. One of the problems in doing that is you usually simultaneously create learning anxiety, which is kind of an OD practitioner's term for resistance to change. So you need to balance those two and make sure that the survival anxiety is greater than the learning anxiety. And you do that by creating a safe environment where people can say what's truly on their mind. How do you help people move? Well, you expose them to new role models. You get them involved in scanning the environment, trying to learn new concepts, or perhaps learn new meanings for old concepts. And last, the refreezing stage is create practice fields where people can try their new expectations, their new roles, try to engage others in change. A critical mass is really important if you're going to bring about true change in an organization. To have a change initiative relying on only one person is dangerous. That people get run over by buses or leave for different jobs or other unpredictable events that occur. And when those things happen, if that individual happens to be the only person that's working on organizational change, everything stops. So you really need a critical mass of people involved. And then last, incorporate the new behaviors into relationships. I always think of them as kind of the rebar. If you're familiar with construction and using concrete, when they pour forms, they put metal bars in to give support to the structures. That's kind of the way the relationships among people and organizations work. If you can build the relationships, the change initiative will be much stronger than if you don't. Not everybody embraces change. We all kind of know that. Some people resist. It takes a lot of different forms, but we all kind of know it when we see it. Some people bury their heads in the sand and think things will go away. Some people need to be pulled into the future. Some people need to be pushed into the future. And some people just need to jump up and down, stamp their feet, and swear at the sky because they're so afraid or so frustrated. Why do people resist? Well, the simple answer is what I just said. They're afraid. And if you can figure out the source of the fear, perhaps we can find a way to reduce or eliminate it. That's always been a significant part of traditional organization development. The model that I like to think of is a force field analysis, which was one that Kurt Lewin used quite a bit. So if you think of survival anxiety, pushing people in the direction of change, the good, positive form of anxiety, if we don't make changes, we're going to have trouble competing. And if you think of learning anxiety as an opposing force, I'm going to have to learn new ways to practice. I may have to change work units. My job may change. I may lose my job. At some point, those types of forces and change initiatives often end up in equilibrium. And you have to make a choice about what you're going to do if you're hoping to continue the movement toward the direction of change. One way would be to increase survival anxiety. The problem in doing that is it usually produces more learning anxiety. So a better approach or a different approach is eliminate some of the learning anxiety. Whether we're studying magnetic fields and physics or whether we're studying human behavior, it's always through reducing resistance that we can attain the objectives that we seek. So think in those terms. If you happen to be a leader in an organization or somebody who aspires to be one, when you get to the point where people are resisting, think of another way to deal with that situation versus pushing them harder. Sometimes resistance can be explained in terms of an organization's culture. And I mentioned my friend Edgar Schein a little bit earlier. This is one of my favorite Ed Schein quotes. A group of smart people do not do stupid things for no reason. Sometimes the culture will influence people to behave in a certain fashion. That is my friend Ed on the left at one of the occasions when I was studying with him at the Cape Cod Institute. So here's what he says about culture. It's the sum total of what a group has learned and now takes for granted as the way to deal with the external environment and its internal integration. It is to the group what character or personality is to the individual. So you've probably all heard the comments from strategic planning experts who say organizational culture eats strategy for lunch. This gives you some insights as to why that is the case. If you think of culture, organizational culture, as being similar to your personality, think what that means. Could you actually change your personality if you wanted to? If you were to go home at the end of the day to a significant other or a friend who said something like, you know, I've been thinking, and I'd really like to see you change your personality. Your sense of humor is kind of obscure, and you always think of things in cognitive ways, and you don't express very much emotion, and went on and on explaining what this personality transformation should be. Even if you agreed with it, how would you go about making a change in something that has been the central part of you throughout your entire life? That's the challenge with organizational culture, sometimes standing in the way of change. Schein had talked about this model of organizational change where there are different levels at which you can analyze it. The easy to see level are the artifacts and creations in an organization. That is the technology, the art that you find in an organization, how people speak to each other, what their engagement practices are. It's very easy to see, but it's also very difficult to understand why those behaviors exist. At a lower level of consciousness, are the espoused values or beliefs. Now, the espoused values are fairly easy to see. They're usually printed on the back of business cards or on placards on the wall. But we all know of examples of where the values that are espoused by the organization don't line up very well with the actual behaviors. So one of my examples that I often use when working in healthcare is if you look at the espoused values printed on the wall of many healthcare organizations, it'll say something like, our purpose is to provide the highest quality healthcare to the largest group of people at the lowest possible cost. Whereas in fact, for people who work in those organizations, they know that's not exactly the motivation. That, yeah, we want to provide good care, but we don't want to go beyond what is expected in the competitive marketplace. We want to do it at a level that is affordable, but that allows us to make a profit and keep the doors open. But those types of value statements don't look quite as good as the espoused values. So there's kind of a misalignment between what we say we're doing and what in fact is driving us, the true values that support whatever behaviors exist in the organization. Schein said, where you find misalignments between the observable behaviors versus the espoused values, the reason for that difference can be found in basic assumptions. And the basic assumptions are about big ticket items like the nature of human nature. Are people good or are people bad? And is that condition immutable? Or is it possible for someone born good to become bad or vice versa? The nature of reality and time and space and our relationship to the environment. Are we at the center of the universe or are we just one planet in the universe? So that is culture. Cultures evolve and they go through stages. And this is an important piece because it explains why many organizations are struggling with change. In the founding stage of an organization, whoever the founder is kind of dominates. The personal values of the founder are the values that are kind of used to create the business and start its path forward. And if that business is successful, the success kind of reinforces those values. As the organization grows and gets older because it is successful, those cultural values become a source of identity for people who work there. And there's a certain pressure to conform to those values, and people who don't will either feel uncomfortable and leave or may be asked to leave. As long as the organization continues to develop and grow, those values are going to be reinforced. But what happens as the organization gets larger is a need to differentiate functions. So I often talk about Apple. When Jobs and Wozniak were working in their garage trying to establish their computer operation, it was a whole lot different than the corporation that exists today. So as they grew their workforce, hired marketing specialists, hired sales people, it kind of differentiated the business as it grew. Certain subcultures formed in the organization. And sometimes those subcultures come into conflict with each other. And the integrated effort that you usually experience in the founding stage gets lost in a lot of internal conflicts. As the organization gets much older, it starts usually into a period of maturity or decline. And the reason it does is because the cultural elements that worked in the early days may not work if the environment is changing. If the conditions outside the organization change, some of those cultural elements may not change. They may not be able to support the change. And that becomes a need for organization development practice. So that is a very quick history of traditional OD. And I want to move to this next piece, the emergence of what is referred to as dialogic OD, because it reflects what's happening in society today. and it offers some suggestions for leaders about what they can do to become more competent. And it's really the core of that connection between leadership competence and organization development. Most of my thinking has changed in the last 15 years or so. I very definitely started out schooled in traditional organization development, but I've changed that definition I showed you at the start over the years. OD is a learning process, not a planned process. Often you can't plan. Often change is so emergent that there's no way to sit back and anticipate what's going to occur. And the other part of it is it's hard to control change. The original view of OD said controlled change for the purpose of improving a service or product. I would say you really can't control it very well. And sometimes where you get to where you were hoping to go, you find out that you have a new problem, or perhaps your success creates a problem. So it's kind of an ongoing process, and it's a learning process. And the leaders and organizations that rely on organization development principles are very much learning organizations. So that idea revolves around this differentiation of OD into two categories that were named by Jervis Bush, my friend, and Bob Marshak, an acquaintance of mine from the Cape Cod Institute. They referred to the traditional organization development as diagnostic and called their variety of it, which they saw emerging in their own practice, as I have, dialogic OD, and the relationship and connection between the two of them. It's not that one is better than the other, but it is that one works better in certain sets of circumstances. And it comes down to your mindset as a leader and an OD practitioner. So there's a photo of Jervis and one of Bob Marshak. Jervis up at the Beatty School of Business in Vancouver at Simon Fraser University, and Bob is out at American University in Washington, D.C. If it turns out you're interested in their work, send me an email or contact me here at the school, and I'll be happy to put you in touch with their work. The dialogic mindset makes these assumptions, and these are very pertinent to leaders that are trying to use contemporary OD practices. The first point is reality and relationships are socially constructed. So if there is an object reality somewhere in the universe, then that's that. But what is more important in contemporary organizations are the various perceptions that we have of those events and how people talking in organizations socially construct a reality. So, for example, if you're a leader and you're trying to run an operation where people are included and are participants and have a voice, but for some reason you're perceived by everybody in the organization as being a top-down kind of person, you still have to deal with that social construction. It may not be real in the factual world, but if that is the socially constructed conversation in your organization, you have to find a way to deal with it. Organizations are always trying to make meaning. They're systems, human systems, trying to make meaning out of what's going on. The words that you use are important. Language matters. Groups and organizations are continuously self-organizing. This is my point earlier about how the traditional Lewin model of change, unfreezing, moving, refreezing, the first two steps in that model probably work pretty well today. It's the third one that I question. I don't know that you ever get to the point of refreezing. I think that groups are constantly changing. Organizations are constantly changing and self-organizing. To bring about change in an organization, because they are socially constructed, creating change requires changing the conversations. And the way that you would go about that is creating opportunities for inquiry and engagement. So, and this reinforces my earlier point, transformational change is more emergent than it is planned. Consultants are part of the process, not apart from the process. Years ago, 30 or 40 years ago, when I was learning organization development principles, traditional OD, there was this belief that a consultant can somehow be a neutral, that she or he can kind of stand removed from the organization and exist in some type of objective world. Well, that's not true. It never has been true. It was just the way that we described the work, and maybe it wasn't ideal back in those days for how to work. But the fact that you have a consultant coming into an organization changes things. Whereas Edgar Schein once said, everything you do is an intervention. Change management, which I described earlier, can work on simple technical problems, but it has trouble with complex adaptive challenges. And my belief is, and the belief of people who ascribe to these more contemporary approaches, the worst error that you can make is to use change management, trying to drive through a change at kind of the individual level using tools that are mandated when you're dealing with a complex adaptive challenge. What is an adaptive challenge? Well, this is Bush's definition for what they are. They require experimentation and learning. And typically, the problems are never solved. So that's the situation that a lot of organizations and a lot of leaders encounter today, where there aren't good answers to what to do. The problems are too complex. There are too many people of different disciplines involved. For example, I use healthcare often because I do a lot of consulting with healthcare organizations. They are highly complex organizations. They have many different medical disciplines that are involved, sometimes with different subcultures across them. They have an administrative component that has to worry itself with keeping the doors open and keeping the business operating. There are a bunch of allied professions that need to provide support to doctors and nurses, and they're not always perfectly aligned. So when you're working in an organization like that, that's very complex, change management approaches or top-down driven approaches aren't going to work well. You really do need to engage people. This is kind of a contrast that Bush put together a few years back, and I'll just let you glance at it. I don't want to go into each point because we really don't have time enough to do that. But as you glance at it, if you find these contrasts to be interesting, again, send me an email and I'll put you in touch with more of the work that Bush and others have done. This chart is worth thinking about, and it's based on research that Bush has done up at Simon Fraser, up at the Beatty School. A number of his graduate students over the years have worked on projects, and here's what they learned, that when you're in a complex organization, when it's the leadership level of the organization that defines the change and then mandates that people lower in the organization implement that change, those types of initiatives almost always fail. When the leaders define the change and then they, the leaders, manage the process, those often fail. Where the stakeholders define the changes and staff manages the process, that can work, and it does work, but you need buy-in at the top level of the organization as to what emerges. Whereas if the stakeholders define the changes and then the leaders manage the process, that almost always works. And that is exactly where dialogic OD thrives. It's about bringing people together lower in the organization who are closer to the work and the problem the organization is trying to confront, who collectively come up with an idea for how to address it. And then the leadership level supports whatever that idea was, often in kind of an experiment to see if the experiment works. And when it does, then they lift it up and make it a bigger thing. So to make the point I tried at the start, I'll rely on Bush again. He is kind of the spokesperson for this new wave of dialogic OD. And I should say that my own experience as somebody who's been in consulting work for over 30 years and senior leadership roles for many of those years, this approach has been one that has been evolving throughout that period of time. Bush and Marshak simply named it, but their experience and how they differentiated traditional OD from dialogic OD was also my experience, that I was finding things like I started to become conscious of the impact my presence would have in an organization. Whereas when I started, when I was a young person, my belief was it was possible to remain objective and somewhat removed from the group. I started to realize through experience that really isn't possible. And sometimes I learned that in spite of the best planning that I could engage, and the information, the knowledge that I acquired over the years, sometimes the best things that occurred were happening in coffee breaks or when people were standing outside the room where we were doing some part of the OD intervention, where they were talking during a break. And so those ideas of dialogic processes really started to emerge probably 15 or 20 years ago. And maybe it was part of, the evolution of OD from the very beginning. But the idea of bringing people together and having them talk together and work together and develop kind of a mindset about working as a team really is the essence of current contemporary approaches to OD, which means that OD is for everyone, not just for consultants. It's for leaders, it's for people who do consult, it's for people lower in the organization who are trying to have greater impact. It's for anyone, literally. Leaders have to be honest with themselves. I love this Will Rogers quote. If you find yourself in a hole, the first thing to do is stop digging. So if you're at the top of the organization, or you're a manager or a supervisor or somebody working as part of a team, and you're just not getting anywhere with your current approach for how to lead, stop doing what you're doing and think about it, and think if some of these dialogic approaches might be more helpful and productive. My friend Schein said this many years ago: critical aspect of leadership is the ability to accept help and the ability to give help to the organization. If the help is in regard to organizational culture, it is usually necessary to have somebody from outside come in and help you decipher it. It is difficult for leaders. In fact, probably of all the people in an organization, the leaders are least able to know what the underlying unconscious cultural assumptions are. Probably people lower in the organization or newer to the organization are more likely to see them. That's the role and the value of somebody who is an outsider, that they will see certain things that the rest of us are now taking for granted. They won't know the reason why those things are happening, but they will raise questions about them. And in doing that, it may help us understand what the assumptions are. The other point is that if a leader really wants to bring about organizational change, he or she is going to have to change themselves to make that possible. His other suggestion is treat your employees as if they were clients. Many years earlier, Peter Drucker, the great management thinker, said that managers, leaders in general, would be better off if they treated their employees as if they were volunteers. So it's this idea of trying to help people lower in the organization succeed that is part of this emergent form of contemporary leadership based on modern thinking about organization development. Effective leaders are aware of narratives. These are storylines that are shared in the organization about how things are that help the organization make sense of what's going on and also provide a rationale for decisions and actions. Every organization has core narratives, and people use those to justify their decisions and actions. For example, maybe the core narrative of one organization is, we try to develop efficient processes and save money, okay? Whereas another organization may say, we're trying to expand our marketplace and we invest money. We view it as an investment. So when people are making decisions and considering alternatives, those narratives have an influence on what decisions get made. So if you want to make change in an organization, it is important to change the narratives. And there are usually competing narratives somewhere in the organization that are underground and not discussable. And so bringing those things to the surface is also one element of contemporary organization change. How do you figure out what the narratives are? You'll hear them in terms of the themes and metaphors that are repeated, especially surrounding decision making, rationalizations for things that are done. And some of them are competing. If an organization says we're going to save our way to success, my immediate reaction would be, good luck with that. I don't know of any organizations who ever have worked their way to great success through cost cutting. I think growing a marketplace and developing a business takes an investment. So I want to move into kind of the tail end of what I have to say and then leave you with 10 minutes for questions. People always say, okay, so how do I do this exactly? How do I become a leader who's using contemporary approaches? I would say develop use of self, which has been defined in a variety of different ways. But the thing that I find most helpful in trying to understand what use of self is, becoming your authentic self, is to take all of these elements of your unconscious, which include defensive,ness and how you sometimes behave as a robot when you don't know what to do, and how you want to evolve as a leader and thinker, and try to make those things conscious. Work with people who can help you through feedback, learn what those hidden unconscious aspects of you are, and then start making deliberate choices that results in using your whole self. Not only the conscious part of what you try to project as a leader, but also what you've come to understand about the unconscious self. And if you can do that, it'll make you more effective as a leader. It'll help you develop other people. It will probably, for those of you who aspire to higher levels of leadership, help you get to that point. How do you develop it? You learn new concepts and tools. Some of the courses that we teach in our graduate management programs here at the College of St. Scholastica will do that. Learning from your own experience, reflecting on them, and engaging other people who support you. Literally going to someone and saying, I need your help. Are you willing to help me develop this capability? Bottom line is this: try to make your actions consistent with the values of OD. This means involve people early in the change process, build what Schein has described as a level 2 relationship, which goes beyond the stereotypic coat and tie consulting or leader relationship to clients or employees, where you actually take time to understand the person at a somewhat deeper level. Always try to help people. Construct safe places in which groups can talk to themselves about themselves. Listen rather than speak, and try to maintain an inquiring mindset. Ask good questions. Ask questions that inform your ignorance, that are kind of designed to disrupt the current thinking in an organization. Don't try to lead with leading questions. Instead, ask questions that inform you about why the organization is stuck. So I think that is what I have to say. There are a bunch of references that were embedded in this session. But I'm going to stop the share, and I'll be happy to provide those to anyone who wants them. I'm going to dump out of sharing. And now I am ready to hear questions or rebuttals or whatever, whatever
Or
anyone is interested.
helpful inquiry.
Helpful inquiries, yes.
Yes. Okay, so at this point, if you do have a question, you can chat that in the chat box down below. That's probably better than unmuting, but you certainly could unmute and ask a question. We are still recording this session. I will be getting this out to everyone that attended and those that registered and were not able to make it. I do want to mention that the next session is Tuesday, January 14th at 1 o'clock with presenter Brandon Olson, who is the program director for our new Master of Science in Applied Data Analytics. He's going to be talking about data analytics for decision making. He has informed me that this won't be a very technical presentation. It's actually meant for or designed for the average working professional at a variety of levels within your organization. If you have access to data where you work, then this would be a session of interest to you. Any questions for Bob before we part for the day? Just seeing some comments saying wonderful information. Thank you.
Give people a minute or two more to collect
Sure.
their thoughts and maybe shoot a question or two if you have them. Thanks for your comment, Matt, about the information. How do you best approach a person extremely resistant to change? Well, I think if you think about why the person is resisting, as I was explaining earlier, as a form of fear, then I would just try to have a general discussion, not get directed to, you know, the fact that a person isn't doing something that she or he is expected to do, but really engage them and ask them what their thoughts are about it and listen deeply to what you hear. And what you're probably going, you know, if you were talking to a physician 10 years ago about electronic health records, they would say, well, you know, this is going to add on to my workload and it's going to require me typing into a keyboard instead of looking at the patient directly. But if you took more time with that physician and you got to the point where you had a relationship with them, with him or her, they would probably say, what I'm really worried about here is that my practice is going to have to change. I was educated in dealing with clients in a very particular way, dealing with patients in a very particular way. And now that I have this electronic technology that I've got to be attentive to, I'm really worried that I may make a mistake, that I may miss something that previously would have understood. So that would be my suggestion for somebody who is extremely resistant to change. Listen carefully to what they're saying and ask good open questions where instead of trying to convince them to bring about whatever change you're seeking, that you hear instead why it is that they have anxieties about it, and then see if you can eliminate those anxieties. That was a great question.
Great question, yeah.
Anyone else? How does OD relate to learning organizations? Another great question. The late Chris Argyris out at Harvard, of course, was one of the people talking about double loop learning and about learning organizations. He was one of the people who contributed to the work of Senge, who is often known for his thinking about learning organizations. I think the way it relates is through that revised definition I did, that through all of these interventions, we as an organization are learning things. And we have to cycle our learnings back into how the system functions and stop thinking about individual problems and instead thinking about the processes and methods that we use to address them, and find out if there isn't a way for us to change our processes in a way that not only eliminates the current issue that's in front of us, but perhaps prevents other issues that we're not aware of from occurring in the first place. So I think that is a connection, that organization development has really always been about trying to make exceptional organizations, organizations that learn from their experience and are able to act on it.
And there's another question on there, Bob. How do you handle management that does not appreciate a bottom-up approach?
Have them come to one of my talks is the answer. I think it's the same mechanism. I think it's through discussion and trying to figure out why they believe that the top-down approach is preferred. Of course, it's difficult depending on where you are in the organization. If you're in the lower level of the organization, how do you get to the CEO exactly? So at a certain level, it takes a CEO or a leader in an organization who wants to learn and is open to having those discussions. But I think the way it will emerge is when the old methods fail, the top-down approach clearly fails, the leader becomes frustrated, doesn't know what to do, and then becomes subject to recommendation or to discussion. So I would look for those occasions where they exist. Or if, for example, the leader of your organization has annual meetings where they sit down and talk to people over coffee or something, go to those meetings and try to develop a relationship with the leader to the extent you're able. Or if you have bosses in between you and the leader of the organization, work with them because you probably have better relationships with them, and then perhaps they can find ways to get you into communications with higher people in the organization. But it's not easy. It's probably, the central problem that most of us face. How do we convince our leadership level that there's a better approach or a different approach to use?
Great question. We have 2 minutes left. Any other questions or one final question?
One of my colleagues here earlier today who knew I was doing this webinar said, so what are you going to cover? And I said, most everything that I teach in our program. So I'm going to try to compress it. And if you want an expanded version of any of these things, you can certainly get it. A lot of times students who, or potential students say, well, I'm not really ready to go into a degree program. I'm too busy at work or something like that. There are ways to audit classes, or there are ways to take certificates that we offer, so you don't have to make that big commitment of time. And I would suggest, if you do have a boss that you think might be open to learning a new approach, that encourage that person to take a look at what we offer. There are lots of very insightful things that we teach that I think will help leaders develop a better understanding of what they might do if they wanted to bring about change.
Great. Okay, well, it is 2 o'clock, so we're going to end the session. I'm going to stop the recording. I'll send this out. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, for your presentation. Thank you for the questions. This was a really great conversation. We'll see you next month on Tuesday, January 14th for Dr. Brandon Olson's presentation. Have a great day.
Thanks.